Do you recognise this interference? It's hard to demonstrate in today's digital world, but 20 years ago, this interference wreaked havoc on television sets across the country. It was caused by these signals, and they were emitted by the new UK police radio system. TETRA, or terrestrial trunked radio, is an international standard for digital mobile communications. Many organisations use TETRA radio systems nowadays, and they can be easily listened to if they're not encrypted. Of course, highly encrypted TETRA systems were gradually adopted by the UK's emergency services, military, and government in the early 2000s. The introduction of any new transmission system can often cause a level of interference to existing services. This is natural, and methods of alleviating the issue are usually quickly developed and implemented. There was a big problem caused by TETRA to television reception back in the early 2000s. It seemed that every time a new transmitter was switched on, local residents were up in arms about disruption to their television service. It took some time to get things sorted too. The main effect, perhaps, was that stories on interference caused by TETRA helped fuel the nonsense rumours that it was harmful to health. What I'll do first for both clarity and to answer a question many people usually ask is explain the terminology. The police and others use a system called airwave, which is TETRA based but has some major differences to a normal TETRA system. I've done plenty of videos on this, which you can find links to in the description below to save me repeating things here. From this point, the cause of the television interference I'm talking about is airwave, the emergency services TETRA-based radio system. The frequencies allocated in the UK for airwave that's used by the police, ambulance and fire services to name just three are 380 to 385 MHz for mobiles and 390 to 395 MHz for base stations. The interference caused by airwave is physically harmless, but any interference that causes problems with other spectrum users is known as harmful interference. Instances of TETRA interference appeared regularly in the news because the transmitters were new, high-powered when compared with 3G towers, and were often the cause of some upset in residential and rural areas. People didn't want them near their homes. They were scared of the rumoured health effects, and they certainly didn't want radio towers spoiling their rural vistas. Interference from TETRA radios had some quite noticeable characteristics, making it easier to identify and then in turn remedy. The UK's digital switchover for television took place between 2007 and 2012, so in the analogue days, because the interfering signals were digital, some common TVI issues were not present, such as audio breakthrough. I'm sure less people would complain if they could actually hear the police through their television, much like you could at the edge of the FM broadcast bands in decades gone by. Since the base stations transmit continuously, the interference didn't stop and start like other forms of interference from private radio systems. TETRA interference was more prevalent when a mast was sighted within 1 or 2 miles from the television and antenna, the TV antenna was vertically polarised, or a masthead amplifier was in use. This is what the interference looked like on a functioning television screen. Two-stage masthead amplifiers with a gain of around 25 dB were much more susceptible to interference issues than single-stage ones with a gain of about 14 dB. The effects tended to vary too. Digital terrestrial television could usually remain unaffected by the interference, whereas analog channels could be wiped out. The interference from TETRA caused what were known as tyre marks on the screen, the name being given due to the fact that the lines resembled tyre tracks. One solution was to remove the masthead amplifier, as it was more likely not needed anyway, especially if it was a two-stage one. Amplifiers should only be used where absolutely necessary. Masthead amplifiers with TETRA filters pre-installed to reject signals at 400 MHz and below were developed. If the interference was still present, a filter could be introduced, and they were quickly mass-produced when manufacturers began to realise that there was a new market for them, and even branded them as airwave or TETRA filters. Bandpass, high-pass, single-notch, double-notch, and channel pass leveler filters could all be utilised to reduce the interference. Let me quickly explain to you what these are. Bandpass filters only pass a certain required frequency range. A high-pass filter rejects everything below the cutoff frequency. Notch filters reject a spot frequency, and channel pass filters pass only the exact channels required. Any filter will reduce the overall television signal, but in areas with reasonable coverage, they don't cause much of an issue, if any. Lastly, it was always a good idea to check the TV aerial. An upgrade to a higher quality aerial was often recommended, and if all else failed, a move to a spot that blocks the signals from the TETRA mast could also be explored. These remedies seemed all well and good, but who would be footing the bill? A spokesman for O2 Airwave said in 2005 the masts were fully compliant with the Wireless Telegraphy Act, and that this was confirmed by independent reports commissioned by engineers. They said the problem could be solved by a special filter or by switching to satellite or digital TV services. Naturally, those affected said that both of these solutions were potentially costly. Ofcom were not much help either. A spokesperson said that the problem had probably occurred because viewers had had amplifiers fitted to their television installations in order to boost the signal. The interference can almost always be resolved by the fitting of an appropriate filter, he added. He also said Airwave is transmitting in accordance with its license and is under no obligation to fund the remedy. The spokesperson also pointed out that nobody had a legal right to good television reception. Naturally, this didn't sit well with local residents affected by these transmitters. On a side note, things were handled slightly better in 2012 when it was reported that almost 1 million UK homes would need to have filters installed to prevent TV interference from 4G mobile signals at a cost of £108 million. A smaller number of homes, around 10,000 it was estimated, needed to switch to satellite or cable TV services in order to avoid degraded picture quality caused by local transmitters. Homes that couldn't receive these alternative platforms would receive up to £10,000 each to, quote, find a solution, and these costs were to be met by the winner of a Spectrum auction later that year. As you've probably guessed, this was all blown vastly out of proportion, and tests of around 200,000 homes in the West Midlands and London the following year uncovered just 15 TV interference issues. In the end, O2 Airwave continued to deny any responsibility for the TVI issues, and cheap filters and the removal of masthead amplifiers seemed to remedy the issue. As the digital switchover took place and more frequencies were utilised, the TETRA TVI issue faded into the past. Let me know if you had any issues with TETRA airwave television interference in the comments below.